I'm Sabrina. I'm 32 and 5 years after I cut contact, my family showed up at my front door with rolling suitcases and the kind of confidence people wear when they've never once been told no. My father met my eyes like he was reading a verdict, not a daughter. "You don't even have a family," he said, voice flat. "We'll take this house." I didn't shout. I didn't negotiate. I pressed my thumb to my phone and hovered over 3 digits I hadn't dialed since the night I slept in a Walmart parking lot and tried not to cry loud enough to fog the windows. If you're watching right now, tell me where you're tuning in from. I want to see how far this story travels. Tap like so the algorithm knows not to bury this, and subscribe if you want to see exactly how people who say, "we're family," can still pick locks they have no right to touch. I'll show you what I did after my father claimed the word family and tried to evict me from a life I bled for. But first, you need to understand how we arrived at a doorstep where a set of house keys felt more fragile than a glass. I grew up in a split-level outside Philadelphia that always smelled like starch and coffee. My dad, Richard, wore crisp shirts like armor and ran a bank branch like it was a courtroom, all rules and penalties. My mom, Diane, floated between double shifts at the hospital and a spotless kitchen you could eat off the floor of, if you didn't mind the sound of someone judging your crumbs. My brother, Brian, is 3 years older and, according to the family mythos, practically born with a resume. Report cards that would have gotten me grounded earned him a steak dinner. When he scraped into State U with a partial scholarship, there was a backyard tent, a tower of cupcakes, and a bow on a new car. When I got straight A's and captained the yearbook design team, my reward was a reminder to clock in on time at the diner. No one said, "We're investing in him, not you." They didn't have to. It was in the way my dad asked Brian about internships and asked me about practical majors. It was in my mom's voice when she said, "Art is a lovely hobby, Sabrina, but you can't depend on lovely hobbies." If there was one person who ever looked straight through the fog of that house and saw me clearly, it was my grandmother, Margaret, my mom's mother, with hands that could thread a needle without her glasses and a garden that forgot it lived in Pennsylvania instead of Tuscany. Every summer she'd teach me how to tuck tomato seedlings into the earth the way you tuck a child, firm and gentle. "Don't let anyone appraise your worth like a house," she'd say, wiping soil off my cheek with her thumb. "You decide your value. And don't count on anyone else to keep a roof over your head. Learn to build your own." By 16, I was taking orders for pancakes before first period and folding sweaters till 9 p.m. on weekends. I saved my tips in a shoebox labeled tuition like the word could shame a miracle into existence. In junior year, my art teacher, Ms. Winters, slid a tablet across the desk and said, "Try this." The first time I clicked a pen tool and watched a curve behave, I felt something in me snap into place like a seatbelt. Composition wasn't a pastime, it was fluency. I learned kerning like a new alphabet. I stayed after school until the janitor flicked the lights and coughed meaningfully. I also learned how to translate passion into a language my house understood. Outcome. I entered design contests, won 2, and printed the certificates on heavy stock so they would look like they mattered. When I showed them to my parents, my dad said, "Ask Ms. Winters what nurses make with overtime." Application season was a chessboard. I sent in paperwork to a few state schools with solid programs and to the community college that had a design track and tuition I could theoretically reach from the floor if I stretched. When the acceptance letters arrived, I lined them up on the kitchen counter between the stack of mail and my mother's grocery list. My dad read the names, grunted, and asked, "Where's nursing on here?" I said the word design. He said the words, "Pay for it yourself." I heard a drawer slam and something inside me closed too, but not the part they thought. The next morning, I signed up for community college, 2 part-time jobs, and the kind of sleep schedule you can only survive if you're 19 and fueled by drive-through coffee. I did 2 years of credits at a kitchen table that was also a desk. After my shifts, I'd lay out logos for fictional companies just to stay sharp. I transferred to a state university with a portfolio that looked better than my bank account. By then, conversation with my parents had cooled to holiday weather updates. When I graduated on a Saturday, my grandmother stood in a floral dress in the 3rd row and clapped like she was trying to keep me on earth. My parents were at a conference for my brother's firm. Later, my mom mailed a card with $20 and no note. $20 is a kindness when it's a waitress sliding you your change with a wink. When it's your mother, it's proof of concept. You are a side project. I packed a car that sounded like it shouldn't attempt a hill and drove to Philadelphia for an internship that might turn into a junior designer role if I called back fast enough, stayed late enough, and learned to pair hex codes with client moods. I shared a 2-bedroom with a teacher named Jessica, who taught me that boiled pasta at midnight tasted like a banquet if you were laughing. The agency was small, weird in good ways, and scrappy enough to hand real clients to people without senior in their title. I made my first billboard for a bakery that overpaid me in cupcakes, and my first mistake, green on green in a rebrand for a garden center. I called my grandmother every Sunday and told her about projects in a language she didn't speak but loved hearing. "You sound like you," she'd say. "That's the whole game, baby." Then the economy sneezed and our sector caught pneumonia. 2 of our anchor clients changed CMO and moved creative in-house. On a Monday morning in November, the lights were off and there was a paper on the door that said to contact HR for questions. HR didn't pick up. I freelanced. I hustled. I answered, "Can you do this for exposure?" Emails with quotes that made people ghost me. I watched my savings turn into groceries, then rent, then overdraft fees. Jessica covered the electric bill and tried not to make me feel like I was being rescued. I promised I'd catch up when a contract cleared. It didn't. The landlord slid an orange notice under the door the same color as panic. I sat on the floor with my back against the oven, holding my phone like a lifeline. I called my mother. "Mom, it's Sabrina," I said, and told her everything in one breath. "I just need 1 month. I will pay it back. I've got interviews." I could hear the TV on in the background, the clink of a fork against a plate. My dad's voice replaced hers like a switch. "You made your choices," he said. "This is why we said nursing. Stability. This is a lesson, Sabrina." I asked for a couch. He said, "We're hosting the association meeting tomorrow. It's not a good time." I hung up because my throat wouldn't let me speak. That night I left a voicemail for Brian. He didn't return it. 2 weeks later, my belongings were triaged into 3 piles. Keep, store, lose. I kept my laptop, my hard drive, and the sweater my grandmother had knit me in college. I paid for a month of storage with my last $100. The rest of my life fit into a trunk in the passenger seat of a car that now doubled as a bed. Here's the part people don't put on social media. Living in your car is a logistics job. You learn which gym lets you in with a smile and which front desk attendant asks too many questions. You memorize the library's outlet map. You find the Walmart parking spot that's shadowed enough to hide you and close enough to an overnight security camera to make you feel less like a statistic. I brushed my teeth in public restrooms and made my hair look like I'd meant it to be messy. I sent resumes out like prayer flags. I called my grandmother and got her voicemail. The neighbor, Nancy, called me back 2 days later to say Grandma had pneumonia. I stared at the gas gauge and did the math and wanted to scream. I was nursing a tea at a coffee shop that tolerated long stays when I heard my name in a voice that belonged to a different life. "Sabrina." I turned and there was Eleanor from my old agency. Tailored coat, messy bun, the kind of woman who always looked like an answer. I tried to straighten my shirt with one hand and hide my bags with the other. She sat across from me like it was the most obvious decision in the world. "You disappeared from Slack," she said. "Where did you end up?" I opened my mouth to sell her a version of the truth that didn't hurt, and what came out was the whole thing. "I'm living in my car," I said, and then I looked at the ceiling to make the tears retreat. Eleanor didn't blink. She took my hands. "When was the last time you ate a meal that wasn't wrapped in paper?" she asked. I couldn't remember. "Okay," she said, standing. "You're coming with me." Eleanor's apartment smelled like laundry and garlic. She fed me soup from a pot and didn't make me earn it with a story. She pointed at the spare room like a coach sending me in from the bench. "It's yours for now," she said. I tried to argue about money. She waved it off like a fruit fly. "You'll pay it forward." The next morning she introduced me to Michael, her boyfriend, who ran a small web studio that needed a designer enough to say yes to a portfolio I was too tired to sell correctly. It was entry-level pay and a line on a resume that didn't taste like failure. I took the job with both hands. I slept. The kind of sleep that feels like drowning and resurrection. When I woke up, there was a missed call from Nancy. The message said, "Come." Eleanor drove the 3 hours to my grandmother's town because she knew I couldn't hold a steering wheel and hold myself together at the same time. In the hospital, Grandma looked like a story that had been told 1,000 times and was coming to a gentle period. Her hand was cool and small. "Hi, Sabrina," she said, and I tried to smile around the lump in my throat. I told her about the job, about Eleanor, about HTML and brand guidelines, and left out the part where I cried in a parking lot. She looked at me like I was a sunrise, the way only someone who watched you learn to walk can. You make your own way, she whispered. You always have. At 2 in the morning she asked me to get a small box out of her purse. Inside were a key and a folded document that smelled like ink and finality. It's all written down, she said, voice stronger for a moment. House is yours. You need roots and you know how to tend them. I tried to argue because bargaining with inevitability is a thing humans do, but the monitor beeped and she squeezed my hand with surprising force. Don't let them decide your shelter, she said. 2 days later she slipped away the way she lived. Without drama, with intent. Grief is paperwork with tears on it. My parents arrived for the funeral in matching black and a silence that had nothing to do with respect. They were appropriate for 48 hours. Then we sat in a lawyer's office and the will was read. My grandmother's cottage, the one with the sleeping porch and the clawfoot tub and the garden that should have a passport, came to me along with a modest savings account and a note in the margin of a copy I keep in a drawer. She invests in herself. Invest in her too. My mother gasped like someone had slammed a door. My father went red and tight around the eyes. Mother always favored you, my mom said later, as if love could be weighed. I didn't list all the afternoons Margaret had brought Brian pie and tried to love him into something soft. I didn't have the time or the energy to persuade people who didn't show up for me to believe what was written. I signed what needed signing. I slid a key onto my key ring. If you've ever been the first person in your family to be chosen for something and also the first to be resented for it, drop the word resilient in the comments. And if someone in your life was your Margaret, hit like in their honor. I want a timeline full of grandmothers. The cottage needed care but not rescue. It had good bones and bad wallpaper. I moved in with 2 suitcases, a borrowed air mattress, and a plant that had survived 3 apartments and 1 car winter. I scrubbed cabinets until the wood showed up again. I painted walls in the daylight and emails at night. I turned the smallest bedroom into a studio, set a thrift store desk under a window, and watched the street like a security camera that also believed in hope. Michael paid me on time. Eleanor fed me when I forgot. My grandmother's neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, brought a casserole in a dish that matched her glasses and cried when I tried to give it back clean. Keep it, she said. That dish has been in that kitchen longer than I've been alive. Feels right. In town I learned faces before names. Tom at the hardware store started setting aside old brass knobs, because your house likes a little history. The librarian remembered that I preferred the books with pictures and words. And Patrick at the bookstore poured cappuccinos with little hearts in the foam that made me feel like someone was flirting with my arteries. You're going to wear that design book out, he said the 3rd time he caught me reading the same one without buying it. The next morning it was wrapped in brown paper with a note that said, renovation consultant fee. Your coffee advice improved our menu. Design work turned into design work. A florist needed menu boards. A plumber wanted a logo that didn't involve a cartoon toilet. Patrick needed new signage and a loyalty card that didn't look like clip art. I built a website with a name that felt like a claim, Elevation Designs, and a contact form that actually worked. I charged embarrassingly little at first because women are taught to apologize with their rates, then raised my prices when my email started to feel like a slot machine. The cottage changed alongside my invoice templates. I pulled up carpet and found hardwood. I replaced a rattling heater with something that breathed quietly. I kept the ugly cute cabinets because my grandmother would have scolded me if I didn't. On Saturdays I put on a hat that made me feel like a person who knew what to do with a spade and turned the garden back into a sentence instead of a paragraph. If you've ever been told your talent is a nice hobby, while someone else gets a car with a bow on it, tell me one thing you did anyway. Tap like if you believe discipline is a love language you can speak to yourself. Subscribe if you want stories where the twist isn't a billionaire fiancé but a woman who refuses to stop showing up for her own life. 5 years is enough time to grow roots you can't see until a storm tries to rip them up. It's enough time to become someone your past self would not believe. By the anniversary of my grandmother's death, Elevation had 3 steady retainer clients, a wall of framed invoices that made me smile like a bank manager, and a routine that felt like a home. I had a key hook by the door, a cookbook open on the counter, and a list on the fridge of which perennials bloom in what month. It would be tidy to say I never thought about my parents, but grief and anger don't clock out. I sent neutral Christmas cards because that's what you do when you're not ready to light a match and you're not ready to build a bridge. They sent nothing back but silence, which I wore like a coat I didn't choose. The first crack in the quiet came on a Tuesday in the form of an email from Brian with a subject line that tried too hard. Touching base. He pretended we'd merely misplaced years like they were keys between couch cushions. Saw your site, he wrote. Impressive. Mom and Dad worry about you. Let's reconnect. I stared at the words like they were a misprint. There was no acknowledgement of the night I stood on their porch in the rain, of the voicemail I left when I was living out of a trunk. Just a smiley face tone and the implied assumption that I had been the one who lost track of family. Patrick and I were eating sandwiches in the garden when I showed him my screen. He squinted like the sun was in his eyes. People resurface for one of two reasons, he said. They miss you or they need something. Guess which one comes with an exclamation point. I didn't answer the email. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later my mother called and used a voice that belonged to a woman in a commercial for laundry detergent. Sabrina. We were just talking about you, she chirped. I let the quiet stretch. Brian said he emailed, she continued. We're so proud of what you've done. Your father and I would love to visit. Family is important. Is that what you call turning away your daughter when she has nowhere to go? I asked softly. I heard her inhale. We all made mistakes, she said, careful in the way people are when they're stepping around a minefield. Let's focus on the future. I told her I'd think about it. I hung up and put my phone face down like it might be contagious. Brian called that night and dropped the pretense. The condo had been foreclosed. Dad had retired without a party because of an internal matter. Mom's back meant fewer shifts. Their savings had become a rumor. Anyway, he said, voice bright like a salesperson, we thought we could come visit Saturday. Catch up. See the place. It'll be good for everyone. I said yes to lunch and no to staying over. I closed my eyes and saw my grandmother's handwriting on the will. Do not let them decide your shelter. They arrived at noon exactly 3 days later. Years had carved new lines into my father's face but none into his certainty. My mother hugged me with perfume that didn't smell like her income bracket. Brian stood on the porch and glanced around with an appraiser's eye. Inside, my mom ran her hand over the countertop like she was checking for dust. You've done so well, she said. So much space for one person. My dad opened and closed cabinet doors like they were drawers in a filing cabinet. Seems your little design business has been profitable, he said, mouth smiling, eyes measuring. Elevation Designs is thriving, Patrick said from the doorway, where he'd appeared with apple cider and the unspoken message that I wasn't alone. My father glanced at him like you look at a crossing guard who stepped into the street at the wrong time. We ate in the garden. My mother talked about their cozy apartment 3 times, each with a different adjective for small. Brian took a very long bathroom break and returned with his phone half hidden and a grin that wasn't for me. My dad asked about the heating system like he was in the market for one. They left with hugs that felt like contracts no one had signed. After the gate closed, Patrick stacked plates and said, Your brother took pictures of every room. I nodded. My father asked about property taxes. We looked at each other over the dishes, 2 people who knew exactly how a 5-year silence breaks. The next week was a drip of innocent questions. My mother called to ask for my pesto recipe and then wanted to know how many bedrooms the cottage technically had. My father texted to remind me that older homes can be expensive to maintain. Brian asked if I kept the original deed handy for sentimentality. I sent one-word answers and started checking the screws on the door hinges. When they returned 2 weeks later, they didn't pretend to be subtle. We were sitting under the maple when my dad cleared his throat like a judge and said, We've been thinking. It makes sense for us to move in. Family home should house a family. Brian can take the room above the garage. Your mother and I will take the primary. That's my office, I said, laughter escaping because disbelief sometimes sounds like humor. Where I run my company. You can move your little computer to the dining room, my mother offered like the solution to a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve. We'll help with the mortgage. There is no mortgage, I said. My father leaned back, pleased. Even better. Saves everyone money. I'm not everyone, I said and felt something in me click into place the way a lock does from the inside. This is my home. You will not be moving in. My mother's face shifted. You don't even have a family, she said, each word landing like a dropped plate. No husband. No children. We need this house more than you do. That sentence lived in my mouth for 3 days afterward, like a shard I couldn't spit out. It would echo again later in my foyer, when suitcases rolled over the threshold as if boundaries were merely decorative. But I'm ahead of myself. That night I called my lawyer, the same one who had read my grandmother's will, just to confirm reality. They have no legal claim, he said. None. If they try anything, call me first and the police second. Secure your entry points. Document everything. So I did. Patrick installed a camera above the porch with a view of the drive. We added a second one near the back door and a third that watched over the studio like a quiet, patient hawk. I changed the codes on the smart lock and felt ridiculous for looking over my shoulder while I did it. The next morning, I bought a plane ticket to a design conference in Boston that had been on my calendar for months and wrestled with the part of me that wanted to cancel. Go, Patrick said. Not going won't stop people from being who they are. On the second night of the conference, while someone on stage made kerning sound like church, my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Jenkins. Thought you were back tomorrow. Saw lights on and movement at your place. Everything okay? The coffee in my stomach went cold. I stepped out into the hallway, opened the app that showed me my own house, and watched a live stream of my father's car in my driveway. I watched my father at my back door with a tool he had no business owning. I watched my mother and Brian carry in boxes like it had already been decided. I called my father. He declined. I called my mother. Declined. I called the landline I kept because my grandmother loved the sound of a bell, and Brian answered on the third ring like a sitcom. Hello, Wilson residence. What are you doing in my house? I asked. Settling in, he said as if that altered reality. We'll talk when you're back. Don't be dramatic. Leave, I said. Right now. Or I call the police. That would be a mistake, he said, and I could hear my father in the background saying something he didn't want me to hear. We've spoken to a lawyer. Grandma wasn't in her right mind when she changed the will. We have a case. My hand shook but my voice didn't. Get out of my house, I said. Then I booked the next morning's earliest flight and texted Patrick. They broke in. Please don't go inside. Just keep your distance and call me if anything changes. If you've ever had to pick between peace and self-respect, you know what the body feels like when you choose yourself. It's not calm, it's conviction. Hit like if you've ever had to draw a line where someone else thought there was a welcome mat. Subscribe if you want to see what happens when a sentence like, you don't even have a family, meets a woman who built her own, and a front door with a new lock. I got off the plane with a carry-on and an anger that made me move faster. Patrick met me at arrivals and drove like he had a badge. When we pulled up to the cottage, there were decorative pillows on the porch swing that weren't mine. There were golf clubs by the door and my grandmother's wind chimes silent, like even they knew better than to be cheerful. I used my key. Inside, the furniture had been rearranged into a life I didn't recognize. My photos were stacked in a box on the floor. My mother's framed prints, weddings I hadn't been invited to, vacations I hadn't been told about, leaned on the mantel like they were auditioning for permanence. I stood in the middle of my own living room and understood how theft can happen with a smile. Dad, my mother called, startled to see me. We thought you were back tomorrow. Clearly, I said, and walked down the hall to the bedroom where my father was hanging suits in my closet, my clothes shoved to the side like an afterthought. In the studio above the garage, my computer glowed in sleep mode, displaced by Brian's mattress. We gathered in the living room because conflict always returns to a center. All of you need to leave, I said, and it was the calmest sentence I've ever spoken. Be reasonable, my father said, managing to make the word sound like obedient. This is better for everyone. Everyone, I said, is not my name. The next part is simple to describe and complicated to live. I took out my phone. I pressed 3 numbers. When the dispatcher asked what my emergency was, I said, there are people in my home who refuse to leave. And while we waited for the sirens, my mother's eyes filled. How can you do this to your parents? She asked. I thought of rain on my shoulders, a closed front door, the taste of a granola bar eaten in a car to the sound of my own heartbeat. How could you? I said. Outside, the wind moved through the maple like an answer key. Inside, someone put a glass down too hard. The house, my house, felt like it was holding its breath with me. If you're here because you've watched this kind of thing almost happen in your own life and wondered how it ends, tell me in the comments the smallest boundary you're enforcing this week. A locked drawer. A new pin. A word you won't apologize for. And stay because the officers will knock, the legal words will be said, and a sentence my father thought was a statement of fact. We'll take this house. We'll meet the kind of paper that's heavier than it looks and a woman who finally believes she belongs wherever she's willing to fight for. The knock came like a metronome. 3 even taps, brisk and businesslike. The older officer, a woman with graying hair tucked into a precise bun, stood in the doorway with her partner slightly behind, both of them bracketed by porch light and late evening. I felt my own spine straighten just watching the way they occupied the threshold. Not aggressive, not deferential, simply present. "Ma'am," she said. "I'm Sabrina Wilson," I replied. "Homeowner." They're inside without permission. Behind me the floorboards creaked. My father's voice arrived ahead of his body. "This is a family matter. We're her parents." The officer's gaze moved past me into the foyer, then back to the folder I was already extending. Deed, will, copy of my ID, tax bill with my name printed clean as daylight. She took the papers, flipped once, twice, nodded. "Sir," she called over my shoulder, the firmness in her voice the calm kind that leaves no room for negotiation. "Unless your name is on the deed, step onto the porch." Silence. Then the sound of my father scoffing, a sound I had grown up identifying as philosophy. Disdain shaped into syllables. He appeared in the hallway, tie loosened, jaw tight, the look he'd use on a junior teller who miscounted a drawer. "You're really doing this," he told me. It was not a question. "I am," I said. The officers entered. Professional choreography followed. Names were taken. Birth dates repeated. My mother clutched a handbag as though it were a flotation device on a sinking ship. Brian hovered in the archway with his phone, filming everything like a tourist at a museum of consequences. "You have 30 minutes to collect immediate personal items," the officer said, eyes never leaving my father's face. "The rest can be arranged through civil channels. Do not remove anything belonging to Ms. Wilson." My father laughed without humor. "Belonging is a complicated word." "Not here," she answered. "Not tonight." What followed was a strange domestic ballet. My mother opened drawers, then closed them, then opened them again as though maybe a different answer might be hiding underneath the cutlery. Brian stuffed chargers and a shaving kit into a duffel and pretended not to notice the camera on the bookshelf whose blue light blinked with unyielding memory. My father moved through rooms touching things as if trying to leave fingerprints on the narrative. The mantel, the banister, the back of the chair where my grandmother used to hang her sweater. When the door finally shut and the flash of red and blue drifted away down the street, the house made a sound I had never noticed, something like a long exhale through old vents. I leaned my forehead against the doorframe, cool wood against hot skin. Patrick, solid, unflappable Patrick, pressed a glass of water into my hand. "You did it," he said quietly. "You kept what's yours." "I hate that it had to be this way," I admitted. "It didn't," he said. "They chose this way. You chose to end it." I called a locksmith before I called my lawyer. It felt symbolic to start with the literal boundary. By midnight, the locks had a new bite. By 1, I had labeled a plastic file bin with bright tabs. Deed, will, taxes, capacity, police report. Paper armor. Thin as a sheet, heavy as a wall. Morning brought practicalities. The back door jamb had splintered where my father had shouldered it open. Tom from the hardware store came with a length of steel and a casual, "Knew you'd call." He reinforced the strike plate, added 3-inch screws, left me with a spare set of keys and a small speech I did not know I needed. "This place has good bones," he said, eyes sweeping over the trim and the light. "You've given it a good spine." Then came my lawyer. Mr. Shaw had the unhurried manner of someone who bills by the hour but earns it. He admired my taps. "Color-coded," he noted. "Judges love clarity." He slid out a yellow legal pad, clicked a pen and drew a rectangle. "Here's the frame," he said. "We already have capacity documents from your grandmother's doctor. We have a properly witnessed will. We have the deed filed and recorded. They can attempt a will contest. They can attempt a quiet title action. They can throw the words, constructive trust, around like confetti. But they will run into 3 things: timing, evidence, and the fact that intention was clear." "Intention was clear," I repeated, more to myself than to him, and suddenly I remembered my grandmother's handwriting, small and stubborn. "Build your own shelter." Mr. Shaw pointed to the rectangle. "We'll move for a temporary protective order preventing them from re-entering." We'll also ask the court to admonish against harassment. You have video of the break-in. Excellent. Make 3 copies. 1 for me, 1 for the detective, 1 for insurance. Don't respond to baiting texts. Save everything. Everything, I echoed and realized I was already in the habit. Years of not being believed trains you to keep receipts. The petition arrived faster than I expected. Thick as a paperback and twice as infuriating. They claimed my grandmother had been susceptible to influence, that I had alienated affection, that the house had always been intended for the family. Language like gauze attempts to wrap theft in concern. Mr. Shaw annotated in the margins neat block letters. Unsupported. Medical records contradict. Notarized. Witness statements attached. The hearing room was bland in the way that spaces become when they see too much. Fluorescent lighting hummed. A wall clock ticked in loud confidence. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and an expression that said kindness is not the same as permissiveness, took the bench. My father sat with his attorney trying to look wronged. Brian wore a suit that still had basting stitches at the vents. My mother brought a tissue she never used. Their attorney spoke of family harmony, pivoted to equity, detoured through regret. Mr. Shaw spoke of documents. He did not ornate his sentences. He let the paper do the talking. He called Nancy, my grandmother's neighbor, who testified to conversations in the garden where my grandmother had said, "Sabrina will understand this house. She'll keep its soul." He called Dr. Patel, who confirmed my grandmother's cognitive scores were what he wrote them to be. He submitted videos of birthday dinners where my parents didn't show, emails where they declined to help when I was evicted, texts where they later wrote, "We'll take the house." Context isn't always legally relevant, but sometimes it's morally clarifying. The judge leaned forward. "Counsel," she said to my father's attorney, "you're asking me to set aside a properly executed will based on speculation and hurt feelings. You're also asking me to pretend the recorded deed doesn't exist. That is not how any of this works." She granted the protective order. She warned against further interference. She said the word trespass in a tone that placed it squarely in the category of words people like my father understand when money is attached to them. We walked out into a sky that looked cleaner than the one we had walked under that morning. The courthouse steps felt like a finish line and a starting line at once. Patrick squeezed my hand. Mr. Shaw gave me the ghost of a smile. "Next," he said, "we breathe." Breathing, it turned out, was a skill. A therapist would later call it a regulation technique. I called it a way to stay in my body when old tapes played. If your old tapes are loud, you already know the playlist. You're exaggerating. You're ungrateful. You're making us look bad. I began keeping a notebook of counters. Next to ungrateful, I wrote, "I am allowed to receive without owing myself away." Next to making us look bad, I wrote, "I am not responsible for other people's mirrors." Midway through those weeks, the ones where the legal machinery clanked and wheezed and moved forward regardless of how many wrenches my family tried to throw into the gears, I filmed something I wish someone had filmed for me years earlier. A middle-of-the-story check-in, not triumphant, not collapsed, just honest. If you're watching this right now and you're somewhere between the break and the rebuild, tell me where you are. Type "in between" if that's all you've got words for. Hit like so this reaches one more person who needs to hear that courtrooms can be humane and boundaries can be learned and family is an action, not a claim. Subscribe if you want to see the rest, because the second half isn't a montage. It's a series of Tuesdays where you choose yourself on purpose. Life didn't pause while we litigated. Elevation Designs kept to its heartbeat. I met clients in the studio over coffee mugs that didn't match. I presented mood boards. I clicked through wireframes. I sent invoices and marked them paid with small silent celebrations. I hired a part-time project manager who turned chaos into calendars and a junior designer who knew how to make a logo look inevitable. At lunch, Patrick would walk over from the bookstore with a novel tucked under his arm and sit on the studio couch, listening to me narrate The Shape of the Day. "Did you know brand used to mean a literal mark burned into a thing to say who it belonged to?" he asked once. "I'm unbranding," I said without thinking, then smiled at the truth of it. Or maybe rebranding. Belonging to myself. Mrs. Jenkins noticed the new locks and the calmer air. She brought lemon bars and gossip, not malicious, just local. "Sometimes the only way out of a story is to become the editor," she told me. "Cross out entire paragraphs. Start a new page. The first time I slept through the night again, it was because I had finally believed the steel in the door and the ink on the paper more than the voices in my head. The second time, it was because I had come home from the studio to find Patrick stringing tiny lights through the viburnum like he was teaching the shrubs to keep vigil. My mother wrote a letter. Not a text, not a voicemail. Paper. Her handwriting had softened over the years, lost some of its tidy nurse's charting precision. I don't expect forgiveness, she wrote. I do want you to know I see it now. The night on the porch. The phone calls we didn't return. I see it all like a slideshow I can't pause. She mentioned my father's blame, externally directed, unfailing. Mentioned Brian's job hunt, selective, inconsistent. Mentioned her own back pain, constant, humbling. She did not ask to move in. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for anything except, if there is a day when you have room for a conversation, I will answer when you call. I put the letter in the file labeled family and surprised myself by not labeling the folder evidence. Brian texted the next day anyway. We're appealing. You'll regret humiliating us. I didn't respond. Mr. Shaw did, with something measured and correct, and copied the court. Appeals are legal purgatory, long, slow, full of Latin. The court affirmed the lower judge in due time. My father's attorney withdrew, citing irreconcilable strategy differences. There is, it turns out, only so long you can sell narrative where record stands in the way. When the court's mandate came down, I printed it and taped it inside the hall closet. That might sound strange. Who tapes a court document next to a vacuum? But that closet had once held my grandmother's coats and later my mother's boxes and briefly the suit bag my father had hung there like a claim. Now it held a piece of paper that said essentially no. A quiet, lawful, life-saving no. Grief didn't leave just because victory arrived. Came differently, less like an ambush, more like a wave. I would be making coffee and feel it roll up. The version of my life where a father teaches you how to change a tire without narrating how you changed your life wrong. The version where a mother shows up with soup instead of judgment. The version where a brother texts, proud of you, without irony. I let the waves come and go. It turns out you can surf pain if you stop calling it drowning. In therapy, we charted a map I had never been allowed to draw. What I want my holidays to look like, small, honest, unperformative. What I want my work to feel like, solvent, creative, no clients who weaponize deadlines. What I want love to sound like, someone asking, what do you need right now? And listening to the answer. The map didn't include my parents' needs because maps aren't about pleasing the river. They're about learning where the rocks are, where the crossings are, where to build the bridge. I built one. Patrick stood on it with me. We invited the people who had proved they could walk without pushing. The cottage changed as we did. I replaced windows with energy-efficient panes that let in light like a blessing. I kept my grandmother's cabinet pulls because they fit my hand and memory just right. I hung a piece of Jessica's art. Yes, that Jessica. The roommate from the old apartment, forever friend, now a middle school art teacher who sends me photos of 7th grade ceramics triumphs. Above the mantel and put away the family photographs that never told the truth anyway. On the anniversary of the night my father tried to move in, Patrick and I took the porch swing down and sanded it by hand. We painted it the color of a good sky and rehung it with new chains. When we sat on it that evening with bowls of pasta balanced on our knees, a breeze came up from the river road and stirred the leaves, and I felt for the first time since I was 22 and signed a lease with a roommate who believed in art, uncomplicatedly okay. 2 weeks later, a letter with a state seal arrived. The restitution order in the criminal case. A formal acknowledgement not just of what they did but of what it cost. It was not a fortune. It was not ruin. It was math applied to broken locks, to legal fees, to time. I deposited the first installment into a separate account labeled Maggie's Garden Fund and cried over my banking app like a person who marvels not at the money but at the fact that truth signed its name at the bottom of a form. The memo line read, restitution. The signature, my father's hand, looked shaky. It looked like a person whose pen had finally been weighed down by reality. I used part of that fund to start something my grandmother would have considered both obvious and radical. A porch light program. One spare room for 90 days for someone who needed 2 things at once. Time to catch breath and a door that locked from the inside. We vetted carefully. We set boundaries. We made a binder of resources. Food pantry hours, job center contacts, emergency childcare numbers, the email of the legal aid lawyer who now sent me holiday cards. The first resident, a barista named Jamie who had been sleeping in her car after coming out to parents who believed love could be rationed, Moved in with one suitcase and apologized for the size of it. You don't have to apologize for existing, I told her, and realized I was also rehearsing the sentence for my younger self. If you're still here, if you've watched me turn a house into a policy, tell me one boundary you're going to write down instead of just holding in your head. Put it in the comments as a sentence that begins with "I will" and ends with a period, not a question mark. Tap like if you want more people stumbling into this video at 2 a.m. to know that there are practical steps after heartbreak. Hit subscribe if you want part 3. The one where the porch light is for more than guests, where a kitchen table conversation doesn't involve a single document to sign, and where the word family stops being something used against me and starts being something I get to define, out loud, without permission. But before that final chapter opens, one more scene. A Saturday afternoon, late sun slanting through the maples, studio closed, bookstore busy. I hear a car I recognize from the way the muffler sighs. A sound from childhood driveways and reluctantly attended school plays. I look through the window and see my mother get out. She does not have a suitcase. She does not have a folder. She has a paper bag that, when she reaches the porch, I can smell. Cinnamon, sugar, apples. I stand at the door and consider the map. I consider the bridge. I consider the closet with the copy of a mandate inside it and the garden fund that now has a balance and the porch swing we painted to look like a promise kept. I open the door but do not step aside. I keep my body where my boundary is. "Hi," she says, small. "Hi," I answer, steady. "May I sit?" she asks. "On the swing," I say. "We can talk on the swing." "We do." She says words that sound like an adult finally choosing to be one. I was wrong. She says words that are not apologies but acknowledgments. We did it because we thought we could. She says words that do not ask me to do anything except listen. I don't want to live like that anymore. I say words that are both a door and a frame. The conditions for any relationship with me are respect, honesty, and no more tests. She nods like a student with a pen in hand. And then, because life refuses to be a straight line, Brian texts me a screenshot of a Craigslist ad where he has posted an old photo of my cottage with the caption, "Seeking housemate for family home." He adds, "This isn't over." I forward the message to Mr. Shaw with the now familiar subject line, then turn my phone face down and hand my mother a fork. We eat pie with our legs stretched toward the garden my grandmother planted, and I describe, calmly, the restraining order that remains in place and the consequences that will remain in force. My mother listens. The swing creaks. The sun drops behind the maple as if to say, "Bring the light yourself." There's one more bend in the road. One more envelope, one more conversation, one more scene in a living room where the furniture doesn't move around every time someone wants a different story. That's part 3. And when we get there, you'll see what I mean when I say the most satisfying revenge isn't losing your softness. It's keeping it while refusing to let anyone mistake it for permission. The quiet after a storm isn't silence, it's inventory. What's broken, what's worth repairing, what you'll replace with something better. In the weeks after the court orders, that became my ritual. I made lists that weren't just chores but choices. Replace the backdoor lock with reinforced hardware. Archive every legal document in a fireproof safe. Water the peonies at dusk. Answer my mother's letter. But on paper, not a late-night text, because paper asks you to mean what you say. The house learned my rhythms again. Morning in the kitchen with the first light making the kettle look like a small lantern. Afternoons in the studio above the garage. My studio, not Brian's annex, where clients' brand stories spilled across the cork wall. Evenings in the garden, where I could tell which beds needed attention by the way the air smelled when I brushed the leaves. Normal felt like a privilege I'd earned. If you're still watching, tell me in the comments the one tiny habit that helps you keep your boundaries in place. A do not disturb window on your phone. A phrase you practice, "I'll think about it," to stop yourself from saying yes out of guilt. Tap like if you believe home is something you protect from entitlement no matter who's knocking. And subscribe if you want more true stories where the twist isn't revenge for its own sake, but justice that makes room for joy. My mother asked for coffee. Not a performance or a summit, just coffee, her message read, written in the careful cursive she used on Christmas cards when we were kids. I picked a cafe nowhere near the cottage, small enough that people looked at each other when the bell rang, warm enough that I could leave if the conversation turned into a script I'd already heard. She arrived early, clutching nothing but her keys. No bags, no boxes of old family photos to weaponize nostalgia. She sat. She exhaled. I'm not here to argue, she said, eyes on the cup, not on me. I'm here to say I'm sorry without asking you to respond. I didn't fill the silence for her. She let it hang a beat longer, then went on. I was wrong when I stood on that porch with Richard and let him speak for our family. I was wrong years before that too. Her voice wobbled. I've been softer with him than I should have been, harder on you than you deserved. It's not an excuse. It's the ugliest truth I own. I felt something like grief and relief braid together. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm protecting me. I know. She nodded once. If there's a way back, I understand it's slow. If there isn't, I'll live with that. The old me would have rushed to soothe, to soften the moment until no one had to feel anything sharp. The new me took a sip of coffee and stayed. There are conditions, I said. No unannounced visits. No triangulating through relatives. No commentary on whether a woman alone needs space. Respect what I build. Respect who I choose. She looked at me like I had turned into someone she couldn't quite recognize and had always hoped to meet. I can do that, she said. It might be the first real thing I've promised you in a long time. We met again, then again. Months made their careful circle. She learned to text before calling. She learned that a boundary isn't a moat. It's a fence with a gate that swings for the right reasons. She learned my garden schedule and started showing up with seedlings instead of stories about Brian. Once she admitted she'd started seeing a therapist. I didn't know how much I had mistaken control for care, she confessed, and the sentence was so clean I wrote it down later. My father tried a different route. His last salvo came through a new attorney who wrote as if he were the voiceover to a commercial for reasonable men. Shared use, equitable access, family interest, all the phrases that try to knock like neighbors while they're actually prying up the windows with a crowbar. Mr. Shaw filed a motion so precise it might as well have been a scalpel. The judge's response was short enough to feel like relief. Motion denied. Sanctions applicable if further frivolous filings continued. The echo dwindled to a mutter and then to nothing at all. At the studio, life tilted toward good news. Jamie, Maggie's Garden Fund's first resident, presented a brand system to a cafe owner who cried twice during the reveal. The second resident arrived with a duffel bag and a portfolio rolled like a map. We unrolled it together on the floor and found a designer with an eye for clarity and warmth, my grandmother's two favorite virtues. Patrick started bringing proof pages from his bookstore's small press experiments. I lettered headings, he debated kerning, we argued about commas like people who planned to be arguing about commas for a very long time. Midway through the year, the town's arts council asked if I'd speak at their fundraiser. I wrote notes, crossed them out, then finally decided to talk from the only place that ever works for me, the truth. I told them about the car nights and the coffee shop days. I told them about the key that didn't fit the lock I'd paid for, and the way a sheriff's knock sounds different when it's also the sound of your own spine. I told them about the first dinner I hosted after changing the locks again, how we passed bowls and stories like bread. You don't get over betrayal, I said. You walk with it until it stops setting the pace. Afterward, a woman pressed my hands and whispered, "My sister has the spare keys to a life she doesn't live in. Tomorrow I change the locks. If you're at that point, say so in the comments. What's the one lock, literal or not, you're changing this month? Hit like if your yes is becoming intentional. Share this with someone who needs proof that boundaries can feel like oxygen." The restitution check arrived in an envelope too formal for its contents. My father's signature sat on the bottom line. Familiar, arrogant, smaller than it used to be. I could have framed it. Instead, I deposited it and split it. A portion for Maggie's Garden Fund. A portion to refinish the floors my mother once called too precious to walk on. A portion for a scholarship we named after a promise I made to myself in a Walmart parking lot. Never again. Patrick proposed on a Wednesday with soup simmering and a book under his arm. Not a diamond on a cliff. A ring in a kitchen. I want to be your ordinary, he said, and I said yes because ordinary with the right person is a kind of miracle. We married under an arch Patrick built out of reclaimed wood and I styled with climbing roses that refused to bloom all season and then exploded the week of the ceremony like even plants can be dramatic when it counts. Eleanor stood on my side. Jamie cried through the vows. Mrs. Jenkins signed as a witness and smuggled in lemon squares. There were empty chairs. I didn't point them out. I didn't frame them in sadness. Not every story has everyone in the third act, and that's not failure. That's a casting choice for your own peace. My mother sent a note the morning of the wedding. I will honor your boundary and stay away. Know that I am watering the azaleas at noon and praying at 1. Later, she left a package on the porch. The mixing bowl my grandmother used to make bread, wrapped in the kind of care she used to reserve for our Sunday dresses. I cried into new linen and called it a blessing. That autumn, we dedicated the studio's little library to Grandma Margaret. Patrick designed the book plates. I designed a mural for the far wall. A line-drawn cottage with light pouring out the windows and a sentence beneath it. Love builds shelter that control cannot enter. People touched the paint with their fingertips like they might feel a pulse. Maybe they did. The place has won. There were setbacks because life isn't a movie that fades to white. A client stiffed us. We pursued it, we won, we learned to ask for deposits that made sense. Jamie's first solo client ghosted her. We debriefed, we drafted better scopes. We wrote a contract clause called the Vanishing Act and laughed until we couldn't breathe. Patrick sprained his wrist shelving a box and discovered he's terrible at asking for help. I tied his apron for him every morning and told him it made him look like a contestant on a very specific baking show. Ordinary kept proving itself extraordinary. One night, my mother finally asked if she could see the garden. We walked it slowly and she touched nothing, just looked. At the porch she said, I remember your grandmother telling me once that strength is polite. It doesn't shove. Doesn't whisper either. I didn't understand then. She took a breath. I'm trying to understand now. You don't have to rush, I said. This house doesn't move for pressure anymore. Before she left, she put her palm on the door frame the way people touch old trees. Thank you for letting me be a visitor, she said, and the specific honesty of that. A visitor, not a resident, not a claimant, felt like stitches where a tear used to be. The last surprise came, as good ones do, on a day that didn't seem special. A young man stood at the gate during open studio hours, hands in his pockets, looking at the mural. He introduced himself quietly. I'm here on behalf of someone who wasn't very good at being a person, he said, and handed me an apology written by my father to the county clerk as part of a restorative justice program. It wasn't addressed to me, and maybe that's why I could read it without the room spinning. I chose power over relationship, it said. I confused possession with love. It was the first time he'd used the right nouns. I didn't call him. I didn't frame the letter. I filed it with the rest of the paperwork under a label I'd started to love. Closed. If you've stayed to the end, I want you to leave this video with more than a story. Write down one boundary you'll practice this week and one kindness you'll offer yourself when it's hard. Put it in the comments so it becomes a small public promise. Like this if you believe that accountability is a love language. For yourself first, for others if they earn it. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there's always one more. Where Jamie opens her own studio, where the scholarship fund sends a kid to a program everyone said was out of reach, where the porch light stays on not as a dare, but as an invitation to those who come correct. When I lock the back door at night, I don't feel like I'm keeping the world out. I feel like I'm keeping us in. Me, Patrick, our friends who slip into the kitchen like they live here, the designers who borrow books and return them with sticky notes full of ideas, the neighbors who drop off cuttings and take home courage. The house doesn't stand because paper said so, though paper mattered. It stands because I do. It stands because a woman someone once told had no family learned to build one out of attention, consent, and care. It stands because love, a verb not a feeling, pays the utilities and takes out the trash and sends that email and changes that lock and answers that door only when it's safe to do so. And when I step onto the porch before bed, the garden hums the way it did when I was little and my grandmother's hands guided mine in the soil. Never let anyone tell you what your worth is, she used to say. I don't. Not anymore. My worth lives here, in the way the air smells after rain, in the way the floorboards creak at the same place they always have, in the way a life rebuilt refuses to apologize for taking up space. You don't need permission to do the same. You only need a plan, a boundary, and the stubborn belief that you belong in the life you're building. Start small. Start now. I'll be here, porch light on, rooting for you.